statues and Instauring Cosmicities, Believe in Life. And I'll hand over to Dennis.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here. Sorry, I'm not prepared.
Inspired by me,
This is quite a short paper, which there aren't any pictures, so I'm just going to read it. It's part of a longer project that I'm working on at the moment, which is to do with Cosmicities, which I hope you get the picture as I go through. Okay. Okay. Oh, that's the wrong one.
Hey, sounding good already, dude.
Is the microphone on? Is the microphone on?
There we are. That's the old one. Sorry about that. Okay. Right. A recent programme on BBC4 presented by the academic Mary Beard looked at radical art practices that challenge our social values. One section considered the toppling of statues of people who, once venerated, are now viewed as pariahs because of their prosecution of abhorrent practices such as the slave trade. An example of the latter is the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, which I'm sure you're all aware of, in Bristol, a merchant whose wealth was built on the slave trade. Though he was involved in trading thousands of slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean, he was honoured by his home city of Bristol as one of its most virtuous sons, and he bequeathed much of his enormous wealth to local charitable foundations, to founding schools and almshouses, and so on. His involvement with slavery and human suffering on a massive scale became a focus of protest in 2020, when crowds of protesters to this statue took the law into their own hands and demolished it, later depositing the deposed metal figure into the Bristol waterfront, from which it was subsequently retrieved and placed in storage. This is just one example of what we might call a rewriting of history, to acknowledge serious historical wrongs and to question current institutional cultures and values. Toppling statues constitutes a radical event that has wider and deeper ramifications for institutional practices. It's an event that can make us begin to question the institutional structures, frameworks and practices as they occur in schools, the health service, the police, the justice system and more. Mary Beard makes a salutary point as she admits that while she welcomes the rewriting of history, watching Colston's statue fall whilst clutching her smartphone challenged her moral certainty about things. We know what slave-like conditions produce this technology, as well as much of the clothing, footwear and other items we purchase, but we tend to turn a blind eye. Beard asks, so how different is my blindness to the blindness of Colston, or the blindness of the people who erected his statue in the 19th century, or the people who consider him a local hero? Not so different, I think. We condemn and abhor human exploitation of humans and our environment, and yet in our practices of consumption and our material desires, we're often complicit. We might view the statue of Colston not as a monument to a virtuous son, or a benefactor, or a perpetrator of unimaginable cruelty, but rather as a proposition in Whitehead's sense. Something that forces us to confront our own statues, manifested in those values and practices according to which we live. In education, we support sound bites such as Every Child Matters or No Child Left Behind, but we continue and are complicit with educational practices in which many children and students are still left behind. Consider the current state of special needs education. We live in a rich and ostensibly democratic country, and yet masses of the population are suffering from the effects of poverty, often having to choose between heating their homes or providing food for the family. We have the means and the resources to deal with such issues, But, in the words of Michel Serres, the French philosopher, we procrastinate in a state of omnipotent impotence. So maybe we can view the toppling of statues as a proposition in the Whiteheadian sense of a lure for feeling or entertaining, not as a statement whose veracity is to be judged. For Whitehead, propositions are to be entertained rather than judged. They are events whose fecundity allows a casting of seeds to the future that may generate new or alternative modes of practice or existence, the emergence of new cosmicities. My aim here, without being too hackneyed I hope, is to take this notion of toppling statues and reflect upon what we might call educational statues that structure educational practices with a view towards what I call a pedagogy of taking care. A pedagogy that is vigilant towards the immediacies of children's or students' practices, but equally vigilant towards the mediating forces that frame, regulate and inform pedagogic practice. I'm shaking. But before this, I'll briefly consider what we might call a more fundamental statue, which I'm sure you're aware of, that of the human subject, viewed as an independent, autonomous being. The subject as an established ground for feeling and thinking. This notion, as we know, derives from the Latin term subjectum, meaning to be below, and it gives rise to the idea of the subject being a foundation for its feelings, its thoughts, and so on, independent from its environment. A substantial entity, akin to the Cartesian idea of substance. Of course, this idea of the subject is not to be dismissed, because it does have a function in our everyday existence, as we talk about people and objects, for example. But it is not the entire meaning of subject, because it fails to take into account vital processes such as individuation or transformation. We therefore require other dimensions of the subject. And if we go back to the Latin root, subject can also be conceived as superjaceo, meaning to throw over or to throw towards. No longer a substantial, independent or self-sufficient subject, identical to itself, but a subject that projects beyond its factual existence, its categories and frameworks of understanding, aiming at that which does not yet exist. We might call this a virtual subject, or even a proposition. We know that in the fields of philosophy, social and cultural inquiry, art, literature, science and technology, and more, the idea of the subject conceived only as subjectum has been toppled and replaced by a much more fluid and dynamic notion of relations and assemblages. Whitehead brought these two meanings of subject, subjectum and superjaceo together in his term, subject-superject. For him, the subject is always an actuality and a virtuality. We might say a fact and a proposition. The force of the idea of a detached subject existing within a mapped-out spatial temporal world is diminished. There is no such thing as a pre-existing subject located within a pre-existing world. There is no such thing as a self-contained local existence, because the environment always affects and becomes part and parcel of each mode of existence. Rather than thinking of an individual existing in an environment, we should consider existence in terms of ecologies, a corresponding and a co-composing of human and non-human processes. This suggests that a subject is not to be conceived in purely essentialist terms, but as a series of relations that are constantly emerging, being affected and affecting within each particular phase of existence. We might say that a subject is a singular creation of the event of each occasion of experiencing within an evolving ecology practices. Its singular form is given the term subjective form by Whitehead, as it emerges in this particular way on this particular occasion, a form that is always in the process of becoming more than. The experiencing subject is at once a particular form, a singular expression, and also a virtual potential of becoming, an actual and a virtual existence. The term subject-superject aims to capture this dual process of a circumscribed mode of expression and its virtual potential. Future becomings will be influenced by the intensive traces and forms of past events as these perish, composing with the novelty and intensity of new occasions. In this process philosophy, the statue of the autonomous individual is toppled and replaced by a fluid and ever-changing ecology of practices that may or may not open up new possibilities, new cosmicities for convivial modes of existence. I say may not, because an occasion may produce adverse or non-convivial effects, as we might witness when particular modes of existence are perpetually endorsed over others. I'm thinking here about modes of practice, learning and teaching in education that are valued over others. The notion of ableism comes to mind. Or when in wider ambits of society, practices of sexism, racism, classism exist, or where practices of inequality and impoverishment persist. We might view this notion of statue in terms of a force of mediation determining what experience should be or become. We can detect this scenario within educational systems grounded in the perpetuation of modes of learning and teaching that mediate and thereby determine outcomes, casting learning and teaching according to predetermined modes. Here, experiences of learning and teaching are meant to fit into a pre-established mould. Whitehead's processual subject-superject emerges not only from a mediated reality, but also, crucially, from the immediacy of events of experiencing and their as yet unrealised potential. The emphasis here is to avoid the captive forces of pre-established moulds and to try to correspond and co-compose with the thisness, we saw some of this morning, with the thisness, the he-cities of assemblages of becoming, where the process of becoming a teacher and learner is a process of becoming other, a working with the gift of otherness. Another statue that still exerts power is the statue of the human, conceived as that which stands apart from and above other modes of existence, and therefore not in terms of a corresponding with other modes. As a critical term, the notion of the Anthropocene challenges and raises concern about the effect of the human on its environment. Equally, the statue of the white male human has denied and excluded other modes of human existence, such as black existence or female existence, and this situation remains. In terms of the former, if the human is conceived in terms of whiteness and its values, then violence and disavowal towards other modes of being and becoming human persist, and whose presence is viewed as troubling. Is the human in education already prescribed? Perhaps another unintended statue emerges here, that of the human as neurotypical and its mediated practices that define the human and which by implication occlude or marginalise those other practices that do not fit. Can we challenge the mediating models? That's a term from Erin Manning. Can we challenge the mediating models that perpetuate particular modes and practices of the human in education? Manning argues, neurodiversity too often continues to be excluded from mainstream education, not because the neurodiverse are not fully capable of participating, but because accommodations will not be made for their modes of function. End of quote. Manning is concerned with autistic modes of existence, but her point can equally apply to other practices that differ from established and valued forms of knowledge that mediate practice. We might detect the situation in our current lack of provision for special needs education, which I've already mentioned, and which some consider to be a national disgrace. Manning continues, quote, "This is not only due to the lack of imagination within education, this is also due to a widespread neurotypical account of knowledge that gives no value to other ways of coming to knowledge and feels no urgency to learn how else learning can happen. To know cannot be limited to neurotypical definitions of knowledge." End of quote. A pedagogy of taking care is a pedagogy that engages with the actual and virtual processes of pedagogy itself, as it has to respond commensurately to each pedagogical encounter. This will entail a constant vigilance towards mediated practices that sculpt practice and the human that they anticipate. This is looking at the idea of toppling statues in art education. What is the relevance of this brief discussion of statues and the processual subject for art education? Is this domain of practice subject to statues that require toppling? Do its narratives privilege particular modes of expression? Narratives that compose and mediate assessment, examination, guidelines, standards, competences? Do its forms of mediation sometimes stifle the immediacy of otherness? What can we say about the state of art education and its future? Think about the statue of the expressive artist's subject of practice in contrast to practice which is conceived as an evolving assemblage of co-responding, involving artist, materials, questioning, feeling, actualities and virtualities. The statues of teacher and learner mediating what teaching and learning are. In contrast, can we say that one becomes a teacher or a learner without being a teacher or a learner? That is to say, without those established mediations of being which define and constrain what teaching and learning are. This seems close to the difference between the notion of poiesis and praxis. Poiesis relating to protean events of becoming and potential, in contrast to praxis defined as a working or a willing towards specified or determined endpoints. One of the other areas I've been working on with that particular point in mind is the difference between homeostasis and homoiesis, which I can say a bit more about if you're interested. A key point to maintain is that by adopting the premises of Whitehead's process philosophy and his notion of subject-superject, is that there is no pre-existing subject who acts upon a given spatio-temporal world, but a subject and a world in the making, a singularity and a cosmicity. The implication of this notion of in the making is that this aesthetic process is the site of all ontology. We might view this assemblage of in the making or as instauring, or in other words bringing into existence, instauring its own art of becoming, of co-composing and co-responding. Such an art of becoming is particular to each in the making, that accrues its own legitimacy, its own coherence, and crucially, its own force of opposition, thereby instauring its own cosmicity. Instauration is a term taken from the French thinker Atkinson, and concerns both this notion of gathering experience and the art of bringing into existence, this gathering and the art of bringing into existence. Implicit to this becoming making is a metastability that, as established or assimilated modes of practice are challenged in an encounter, they may become transformed or modified by the imminent immediacies of practice and the potential for novel instaurations. This becoming making process is not to be viewed in terms of constructing a pattern to follow, but to the contrary, to maintain an openness, a metastability to contingencies and events that co-compose assemblages of becoming making. Such an art may be stymied by the forces of institutionalisation and its mediated subjectivities. If art education is viewed in terms of the statue of schooling, then it throws a mediating and constraining force around practice. Practice becomes mediated by established techniques and modes according to which practice is valorised. Just as art practice is impossible to capture in language, we have to acknowledge that practices of teaching and learning are equally impossible to capture in their immediacies, unless of course we conceive and limit, mediate, such practices to pre-established agendas and narratives controlled by particular interests and values. Both practice and pedagogy of taking care emerge from a corresponding between human and non-human participants within a specific environment. As such, they constitute different ecologies of practice, plurality of ways of making, of doing, being, and capacities to be affected. Art practice is never concluded, and the same can be said for a pedagogy of taking care, because both practices are exposed and open to the contingencies of life. And life, for Whitehead, always lurks in the interstices, beyond and between the boundaries or established formats or schoolings that would try to capture life. Life is always more than. Such interstices constitute the springboard for new coherences to be constructed, new modes of practice and their potential. Both art practice and the art of a pedagogy of taking care are oriented towards eliciting or reducing potentials as they arise in the events and contingencies of practice. A pedagogy of taking care has to work hard to avoid the institutional capture of schooling, and thus art education that employs such a pedagogy has to escape this apparatus of capture. Another way of putting this, already mentioned, is that both the art of a pedagogy of taking care and the art practice emerge from the imminent immediacies and interstices of practice, in contrast to the mediated practices, the models and categories of schooling or art that precede experience. Now, I'm not saying that we only have the immediacies to deal with. What I'm saying is that we have to be careful of established notions of practice so that these do not obscure or occlude immediacies which are confronting us. Incidentally, this distinction is one, I'll leave that out. And the art of becoming making in both the pedagogy of taking care and in art practice is a becoming other in the process and assemblages of corresponding, a becoming other that facilitates further potentialities. This fits with the processual nature of life and its interstitial potential for novel instaurations. The time of mediation functions like a receptacle that already frames practice, whilst the time of immediation, of imminent immediacy, concerns the emerging, corresponding and co-composing of assemblage, colleges of practice, that reform and mutate as new experiences and their conditions materialise. Reflecting upon the current state of art education today and what we need to do next is a matter of working with those practices and assemblages in the making that we call children, students, teachers, as they correspond and co-compose, actually and virtually, with encounters initiated in the pedagogical context. This would necessitate an ongoing instauration of practice and its evolving cosmicities. The ever-expanding dominion of art practice can serve as a pointer for the institution of art education to avoid institutionalisation. Is this possible? Works of art or art practices can challenge our sensibilities in different ways and force us to rethink, to reimagine, or expand our vision and open new possibilities, new cosmicities. In our epoch, the field of art practice has become increasingly diverse along with its materials to the extent that it's difficult to try to circumscribe today what counts as art. Yet its evolving transversality and inventiveness provides food for thought for reflecting upon its education. Can we say the same of our encounters with the diversity and the divergence of students or children's work in the making? Do such encounters provide food for thought and open up new possibilities for the making of pedagogic practice? Rather than institutionalising practice, where practice may be sculpted according to already mediated categories and forms, the dominion of art education might be better conceived as instituting practice, bringing practice into being, not as a reproduction or a representation or a recreation, but as a singular instauration for each learner and teacher towards new cosmicities. This is not to argue for the redundancy of inherited practices and knowledge, but for their novel instaurations within each practitioner's ecology of practice. When art practice is fundamental to education, then it has to be released from or divested of the institutionalising force of schooling. When education is central to becoming making, rooted in and relevant to each learner's mode of practice, its appetitions and potentials, it has to be conceived in ethico-aesthetic terms as an art of practice that entails a corresponding and co-composing singular to each practice. So where does this leave educational apparatuses such as competencies, assessment, standards and so on? Would we be better, for example, thinking of ecologies of competences or ecologies of assessment? Or do these terms drag us back into a rationality that we want to exit? The older systems of identification methods for skills and knowledge now require more interdisciplinary and transversal approaches rather than compartmentalised competencies, as the continuous acquisition of new skills and modes of practice emerging in our life worlds reconfigure practice and its potentials. Again, the domain of art practice, but also other domains such as science, geography, technology, computing, and so on, illustrate the increasing transversality of practice and learning. Education can't ignore this challenge, or it may suffer the fate of a stupor as it engages with the task of helping to construct futures different from where we are currently and which we do not yet know. Unless, of course, in stupor we channel along pre-established routes towards their already determined and probably redundant endpoints. We know that everyone constructs knowledge and practice in diverse and diverging manners. And we also know that education is important to bring about futures that we do not yet know, but which we need to feel equipped to cope with their challenges. In this respect, we might conceive pedagogic work as the instauration of cosmicities, the instituting or bringing into existence new modes of existence and potential. This would involve more than the production or the reproduction of established practices and knowledge that constitute human and non-human life as we know it, but also those as yet unknown virtual and emergent practices, ways of knowing and their pathways of becoming. This invokes an equalisation which avoids any common measure, but works with each world's concerns and matterings that constitute their cosmicity. It pushes pedagogic work, a pedagogy of taking care, from an established comfort zone and its recognised subjectivities towards other existential realities and their modes of sense-making. It would be to mobilise the authority and obligations of pedagogical practice in a more innovatory direction. Deleuze and Guattari invoke the notion of cosmic artisans, which refers to those practices of invention and articulation of worlds and peoples to come. The cosmic artisan is the one open to human and non-human forces for the instauration of cosmicities, and this will include not only forces from our current epoch, but those lingering in past epochs awaiting reclamation, as well as appetitions for a future. They argue that artists have the capacity to create new earths and a new people. In other words, new cosmicities. Can we say that art educators are charged with the same task? Can we conceive scenes of art education as propositional communities in the Whiteheadian sense of a proposition, as an event that throws out lures like seeds to the future? I just want to end with some final thoughts. The educational system that we've inherited is grounded in the ideas of civilization and modern knowledge that arose around, or a bit earlier than the mid-18th century. And implicit to these notions is the idea of progress in science, technology and other domains. One consequence of these onto epistemological developments and the idea of progress was that European knowledge and values were viewed as superior to those existing in other parts of the world. Such knowledge and the idea of unlimited and upward progress was captured by capitalist economics that then drove industrial production, leading to extractivism, ecological devastation, climate change, imperialism, colonial expansion and more. Many would argue that the idea of unlimited and upward progress is a statue that needs toppling, which in turn requires us to reflect critically upon the notion of civilization as we have come to know it. In doing this, perhaps an alternative to civilization might be possible. Perhaps the idea of uncivilization, as promoted by the arts-based collective The Dark Mountain Project, can be engaged with, and then we might reflect upon the kind of values that might underpin educational practices in such an uncivilization, as well as the task of learning how to live after progress. What would an uncivilized education look like? What part could an uncivilized art education play?
Thank you, Dennis. Now, in our schedule, we actually don't have space for questions right now for Dennis.
Yes, we can.
Are we okay for
Yeah,
that?
we can.
Because I was going to say, if you want us to all go out and read out outside, and we can do questions for Dennis outside whilst you set up. Would you like to do that?
We're happy to give a bit of time.
You're okay?
Yeah.
And you can spare time for that. Okay, so we can have questions for Dennis. Neil has a question.
Hi, Dennis.
Hi.
I really like your metaphor of toppling the statue of the subject. I'd like to just explore it just a little bit. It reminds me of Nietzsche, who talked about philosophizing with a hammer. Philosophizing with a hammer.
Yeah.
Of course, his image wasn't about smashing statues. It wasn't a big hammer. It was a little tiny hammer, and he tapped the idol to see what noise it makes, whether it's hollow or not. And in terms of, so this is about sort of how radical a claim you're making. So you talk about the subject being replaced by an assemblage of practices, and I wouldn't go that far, and I'm interested to know how far you would go. I would say maybe, but only if that includes the essentially human practices of giving and asking for reasons, and that depends upon a rational, unified subject.
Yeah.
So my question is, are you smashing the statue? Are you drowning the statue? Are you toppling the statue? Or are you tapping?
Well, I think this notion of, I think relationality is primary to what I'm talking about. So we're always in relation, whether with each other, with the world, with objects in the world, and so on. So this notion of separating the human from that is something that I wouldn't want to defend. And along with that, I mentioned these notions of homeostasis and homeoesis, or metastability. It seems to me that part of being human is to do with having things which are stable, because unless we're stable in some sense, language allows us to be stable. Rationality allows us to impose a stability upon things. But we're also open to this notion of stability in a flow state, this homeoetic or metastable state, where the encounters, the relationalities in which we engage on a daily basis will affect that stability. So you have a picture which is more dynamic than the subject, the dependence of a unified subject. We're dealing with a combination of stable states, but stability in a flow system of relations. And the notion of uncivilization is not to offer something like barbarism, but it's to open up this notion of what do we mean by civilization? What is civilization based upon? And the civilization that we know, that we've inherited, comes from the 17th, 16th century. 17th century. The rise of modern science and so on, modern rationality and so on, which have constructed a way of being human. There is no such thing as the human. It's a composition. And that composition has a historicity to it. And out of that comes a civilization. And this notion of progress, this notion of endless progress, that's what we're here to do, in schools and blah, blah, blah. And what I'm trying to say is that we need perhaps to, it's worth looking at that Dark Mountain manifesto, which is only 12 pages online. What we're trying to do is to offer an alternative to this kind of the way civilization has been built up over the last 200, 300 years. So, in my terms, it would be something towards what Illich was talking about in terms of his notion of conviviality. Having an education which is not driven by economic ambition and so on and so forth, and the production of teachers and learners to serve that economic ambition, but an educational practice which is much more to do with convivial states of being and the difficulties that surround that, because it's less stable. But we need then to have ways of thinking, theories, concepts, etc., to try to deal with that, what's the word? Precarity.
I was just thinking, sorry, about your sort of thought about the hammer as just a tool. It's a tool in that respect. And I was, as a sculptor, I'm thinking about how a hammer sometimes you will use to test. To you know, if I have a piece of stone, I will use the hammer to look for flaws, to listen. You engage the hammer, not to shape necessarily, but to actually go to sort of start to look for fractures, to look for imperfections, to think about. So it can be an exploratory as opposed to a...
I think that's what Nietzsche meant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that seems to be, if I'm making a painting, when I think about that process, I'm making a painting, I get stuck, what the hell am I going to do next? And something contingent happens. And, that opens a new space. You know, I might be making a mark, and then the possibilities of making that mark. So there's this dialogue. That's the relationality. So the human is to do with this co-composing with humans and non-humans.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, about the Dark Mountain Manifesto, I was the first person to sign that manifesto. I've since had, questions and doubts, but the thinking there was that the Earth crisis is so catastrophic that it will create an uncivilization, and that in the process, this kind of trans-apocalypse, that we have to practice living in uncivilization in order to create kind of optimal scenarios, and also to kind of create new stories. So I suppose the question is, will the statues be toppled anyway? Well, because the Dark Mountain thinking was 12 years ago. Actually, no, it was 14 years ago. The Earth crisis has accelerated so much. So are we now, in a totally unsteady state where, very soon we're not really needing to rethink education because it's just going to it's a slightly catastrophic question, but
I think we are in a state, metaphorically speaking, and I think my own view is that the education system is not fit for purpose, and so it needs to be rethought, but based upon different principles. In other words, it needs uncivilizing. The little hammer, can use your metaphor, in order to construct education upon different principles, which will better serve ourselves and our world.
I suppose it's a question of time, how long that takes while around us.
I don't know. I remember when the national curriculum came out in 1988, I was horrified by this idea, but it's still here.